Hello! I know nonfiction tends to scare a lot of people. It is boring compared to novels, not entertaining enough, or too intimidating, too intellectual. But I'm here to tell you that you're probably already consuming a lot more nonfiction than you think that you are. Most podcasts are nonfiction. If you read long essays in the newspaper from your favorite Substack author, that's nonfiction. If you enjoy watching YouTube, you are consuming non-fictional stories about people's lives in the form of vlogs. If you enjoy humorous takedowns of bad books or video essays about pop culture, these are all examples of fun and entertaining forms of nonfiction that are probably already a part of your life. So why not make it better by also adding some nonfiction books? If you're new here, hello, my name is Leonie and I mostly make videos on here about fictional novels, fantasy books, but I also really enjoy reading nonfiction now and then, and I think that the nonfiction subgenre doesn't get enough love here on YouTube, and I know a lot of people can be a little bit intimidated by them, but I think so many people would enjoy reading nonfiction so much, so that is why for today I've decided to make a beginner's guide to nonfiction. I'm gonna help you find the perfect nonfiction book to start with, but I also want to give you some tips on how to find them and how to read them critically. Let's start with the question, where to start? How do you find a nonfiction book to read? Because there's a lot out there. And recommending nonfiction books can be a little bit different than recommending fiction books, because if people are recommending novels to you, sometimes it can really just be like, yo, this story was just so well written or so good or maybe so emotional, and then you don't even really need to know what exactly the plot of the book is in order to pick it up. But when it comes to nonfiction, it really is vital that you are interested first and foremost in the content of that book, because I think that is what really fuels nonfiction reading, is your own curiosity and whatever it is that you're interested in. So that is my first tip on how to find a nonfiction book to read, is figure out what topics you are actually interested in. The nonfiction genre is vast. Maybe you want to know more about famous people's lives, then there's memoirs for you. Maybe you want some productivity tips, there's self-help. Or maybe you just want to know about the famous female serial killers of history. There's a book for that too. There are many nonfiction subgenres. There's politics, history, self-help, autobiographical, investigative journalism, so much. At first, you really have to ask yourself, what topics am I personally interested in learning more about? If you are a very curious person that has a lot of things that they want to learn more about, I have another tip for you, especially if there's something you want to learn about specifically because you want to learn how to do something, like a skill you want to learn. Maybe a book is not going to be the best place for you, but the sponsor of today's video is Skillshare. For example, the past year I've been really wanting to learn more about digital drawing on my iPad because I enjoy making little illustrations in my free time. Now, reading about illustration isn't necessarily very helpful, but watching videos of other people doing it and teaching you how to do it, that is super helpful. And I can do that on Skillshare. They have tons of classes about using Procreate and different illustration techniques that I found super helpful. And it's been really encouraging me to spend more time on something that brings me a lot of joy. But Skillshare has something for whatever it is that you want to learn. Skillshare is the largest online learning community for creatives. They have classes on journaling, writing, social media marketing, illustration, anything. Skillshare can help you go from beginner to advanced in no time. And I think that if you're watching this video, you are someone who is curious and wants to learn new things. So in that case, I really think Skillshare is perfect for you. And you can try it out by starting starting now because the first 500 people who click the link in my description will get a 1-month free trial of Skillshare. So get started today by clicking the link in my description. So my next tip is to just go to a bookstore and just browse the nonfiction section. So going to the nonfiction section can be a little overwhelming because it's very, very large. But just like in the fiction section, there are subsections. If you're interested in psychology, go to the psychology section, and then usually within the psychology section there will be little subcategories for productivity or mental health or sexuality, so you can find the exact topic that you're interested in. And here's the great thing about nonfiction books that makes browsing through them different than through fiction books, is you can usually tell immediately just from the title what that book is going to be about. Like, the title will say a lot about the topic of that book, as opposed to like the fantasy section where every book is called like The Prince of Broken Bones or like The Kingdom of Rose and Shadows. A third place that I get my nonfiction recommendations is actually through the audiobook app that I use. I use Storytel, but I'm sure any audiobook app has this feature where it will recommend you other books based on the books that you've already listened to. And yet again, because the titles of nonfiction books are so self-explanatory, I often find other books on a relatively similar topic that I've already listened to just through Storytel recommending me titles. The next place that you can get recommendations is actually through the sources of video essays or podcasts. If you sometimes like listening to podcasts about a topic that you're interested in, or you watch video essays about topics that you're interested in, usually these have at least one book as like their source, which will often be linked in the description or in like the show notes of a podcast. So if you're listening to something and you're like, this is really interesting, write down the book that they used as a source and read the original source. For example, a lot of people were really interested in a video that I made a month ago about communication differences between men and women. For that video, I got a lot of information out of the book Word Slut by Amanda Montell. So if you found that video interesting, I recommend actually reading the book Word Slut by Amanda Montell. And lastly, it is always fun to read nonfiction books in publication series. That is also where I get a lot of my recommendations. Is I just go to a bookstore and just search. There's usually like a shelf where there's like a bunch of books from the same like publication. How do I explain this? I'm just gonna show you an example. So Penguin has a series called Penguin Great Ideas. I'm sure you've seen these in bookstores. They all look like this. They're all like really short books that are kind of like a condensed version of philosophers' ideas. So for example, years and years ago, I bought The Myth of Sisyphus by Albert Camus because I'm pretty sure I watched a YouTube video about it, and then I was like, let me read the original book. Got this edition, which is the Penguin Great Ideas edition. And now every time I'm in a bookstore and I see the Penguin Great Ideas editions, I'm like, maybe there are other books that are also interesting in that category. And that's why I now also have a book about existentialism by Simone de Beauvoir, a little bit of Nietzsche, and also Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own has an edition like this. And they're cute and matchy-matchy. Another example of books that I've been kind of going through this year are the introducing graphic guides. These are all really short nonfiction books that are very like based on graphic information, which I love. I love it when the information is presented to me with pictures. And again, they all look nice on the shelf. And now I have a book on like random many topics like consciousness, fascism, linguistics, sociology, chaos, and postmodernism. Interesting. And last but not least, of course, you can get your recommendations from the internet. Booktubers or talkers or Instagrammers giving you recommendations, and I will also give my like beginner friendly nonfiction book recommendations at the end of this video. Those were my tips on how to find new nonfiction titles that are great for you, but now I also want to give some tips on how to read them, because reading nonfiction it's obviously obviously just a little bit different than reading a story, a fictional story. You kind of have to put on a different kind of critique hat, so to say. When it comes to nonfiction books, I think they have a kind of status. So especially books, we really give books a lot of status. So I think that means it can become really easy to just take everything that you read in a nonfiction book for truth, when that is not really the case. So the first thing, that really like baseline tip that I want to give is always be aware what kind of nonfiction book you're reading. Are you reading like a factually based nonfiction book or a more story-based nonfiction book? Is the book presenting you with information, or is it presenting you with personal stories and anecdotes, biographies, personal essays, right? A collection of personal essays or a book of culture criticism is very different from like a more informational nonfiction book. So it's always just good to kind of keep that in mind. Like, am I reading like an educational piece of work that is giving me like scientific knowledge, or am I reading someone's opinions on something? The second thing to be aware of is, are sources cited? This is again a very basic thing, but you'd be surprised how many nonfiction books make all sorts of claims and then just don't cite any sources. Like, they'll make big claims about studies and you just can't find these studies anywhere in like footnotes or a biography at the end or something like that. When the author presents you with their theory, are they actually backing that with like scientific articles or sources? Or are they just saying something? Because unfortunately, just because information is in a book doesn't mean that it is necessarily 100% true. This is especially common in the self-help section. I've noticed if you read self-help books, there will be like so much self-help books that are full of like productivity tips or like tips on increasing your mental health or like being more productive or doing better things or living a happier life. And then when you look closely, you realize it's really just the author's kind of like own random theory about life based on like their own observations instead of actual psychological research. So just keep that in mind, like be aware of that. Again, am I reading just someone's opinion, or am I reading like information from science that is being presented to me? And even when there are sources cited, of course, most of the time that you read a theory, it could just be, you know, one theory in a vast field of many, many theories. And the last thing you should always be aware of is the author actually an expert of their field in the book that they're writing about? A really good example of this is an incredibly famous nonfiction book that was one of the first books that really got me into nonfiction, but that has been criticized a lot, is Sapiens. So Sapiens is a nonfiction book about humanity all the way from when we lived in caves to today, and kind of the author's theories and ideas on how we lived and how we stayed together as a society. Now, the first thing that I already mentioned is when I first read this, I thought this is the truth on the matter. And the older I got, I realized that this was actually just this guy's own theory and not like the scientific truth of it all. It was just this one guy's theory, and there were many, many other theories out there as well. The second thing is that he has been wildly criticized by anthropologists for being wrong. Because that's the thing, the author of Sapiens is a historian, but what this book is basically a work of anthropological, sociological theories. And the author is a historian, so not an expert on anthropology and sociology. And so predictably, he got criticized pretty harshly by actual anthropologists for having very, very weak theories. And this is something I never thought about when I picked it up. I just read it and I was like, this is the truth of the better, and I will believe everything that is in this book. But it's only later that I realized, oh, not only is this just one guy's theory, it is also the theory of a man who is not even an anthropologist himself. So those are my tips of things to keep in mind when you are reading nonfiction, so you can remain critical. And lastly, I have a kind of like fun tip on how to read nonfiction books. I highly recommend buddy reading nonfiction books. I think this is so underrated. People are always talking about buddy reading fiction books, which is super fun, of course, because you can discuss the characters and the plot together. But buddy reading a nonfiction book can spark so much conversation, so many interesting discussions with your friends. For example, me and my friend Eliana really wanted to read more feminist nonfiction books, so we decided, hey, let's read together a nonfiction book. Not only does it make you like remember what you read better, because you know you are discussing the information instead of just kind of taking it in and then forgetting it. You're talking to your friend about it and kind of reiterating it and adding things to it and learning your friend's perspective. It is also just really fun. And another thing that we did that I also highly recommend is swapping the same copy of the book and writing our thoughts in the margins. So when you read the book, maybe you read like a few chapters, and then every time you read something interesting, you don't just underline it, but you also write down your thoughts, and then you give it back to your friend, and then when they read that chapter, they see your thoughts and then also add their own thoughts, and then also start reading the next chapter and write their things in the margins and then give it back to you so you can continue reading. So not only does this give you a really fun edition of a book that has both of your thoughts in it, it is also a more fun way of reading a nonfiction book because you're extra engaged, because you're making little notes, but you're not just doing it for yourself, you know that you're like almost telepathically speaking to your friend in the book. And I want to end this video with giving you my personal recommendations of some nonfiction books that I really enjoyed, that I also think are great if you're kind of new getting into it, aka ones that are pretty readable and pretty easy to get into. Of course, I cannot give you like a comprehensive like list of nonfiction books that kind of represent any subgenre out there. Just like with fiction books, I clearly have a bias towards certain topics that I'm just interested in. So this recommendation list is very biased through my own personal interests, but I hope they at least align a little bit. Okay, first I want to recommend 3 books that are kind of essays about culture criticism, which is something I personally really love. I love cultural criticism essays. The first one that I'm going to recommend is Trick Mirror by Gila Tolentino. You may have read her long reads in the New York Times, and this is her collection of essays that are about just modern life, being a woman in the modern world, how social media kind of shapes our view of ourselves. My favorite essays in here is, I think, our most famous one, Always Be Optimizing, about how especially women are encouraged to always optimize themselves, always make themselves prettier, fitter, better looking, etc. Another one that I really loved, I mean, I loved every single one of them, but The Story of a Generation in 7 Scams, where she goes over like 7 millennial scams, things like I think she goes over the Fire Festival, but also like some student debt. She calls student debt a scam. She just goes over 7 scams that have kind of shaped the millennial generation. And I love stories about scams, just like I love stories about cults. And she writes super readable, very narratively. That's kind of the way most essays are written. They're kind of like a story that also makes you think. The other kind of cultural criticism that I would recommend is All About Love by Bell Hooks, which, as the title says, is about love, but not just in the kind of like wishy-washy romantic sense, also a little bit, but it really is a work of intellectually thinking about love the way we would intellectually think about, honestly, anything else. We tend to kind of skip love when it comes to really critically looking at our lives. And she just has so many interesting takes on how to look at relationship love, but also our friendships, our families, the way we love our communities, the way we let it impact our politics, our spirituality. I think anyone should read this. And again, Bell Hooks writes in a very narrative style of writing. It's very readable. It is almost as if you're reading a story. Oh, it's starting to get dark already. I keep forgetting how early it gets dark. It's really getting winter. Anyway, I have here Hope in the Dark. Wow, so topical. Rebecca Solnit is another one of those authors that writes essays that are very educational, but still extremely readable and easy to get through. And this one is kind of a collection of stories of things that went right in history, right? Like she talks about social change and activism in the past 5 decades that went well, to kind of give you a little bit of hope in times of darkness. Let me recommend some philosophy books if you are interested in that. I think the most readable one that I recommend all the time is The Tao of Pooh, which is Taoism explained through Winnie the Pooh. Yes, it is about the author Benjamin Hoff having a conversation with Winnie the Pooh and kind of going over some of the adventures that Winnie the Pooh went on, and then kind of explaining and linking them to Taoist ideas. And because it is about Winnie the Pooh, it is also kind of written like Winnie the Pooh. So it is written in this very simple, easy to read, almost childlike way, but that is not to discredit the ideas that are being presented in this. And then another book that is way more information dense, but from an author that is again very, very good at writing things down in a very understandable and also entertaining way. It is Sarah Bakewell's At the Existentialist Cafe, which is about existential philosophy. So Simone de Beauvoir and Sartre and Albert Camus. I read this while I was also taking a class on existentialist philosophy, and it was such a great addition because, you know, in class I really went over everything in a kind of like cut and dry way, whereas Sarah Bakewell, she goes over all the kind of cut and dry ideas of these philosophers, but she also tells you a little bit about their life and their childhood and the things that went on in their life that influenced the ideas that they got. And that was actually such a great addition to me taking that class, because kind of knowing a little bit about who these philosophers were as people actually explains a lot about their ideas. So this one is a little bit more information dense, but again, Sarah Bakewell does a great job at kind of adding narrative to it, adding a story to it. I'm just gonna sit a little bit closer to the window because it's rapidly getting so dark. Then I have 2 books that I recommend that really almost feel like fiction in the sense that they are so like story based. The first one that I would recommend is a biography. It is I'm Glad My Mom Died by Jeanette McCurdy, who you may know as Sam from iCarly. If you grew up with that show, if you grew up with Nickelodeon shows, I highly recommend listening to it, because not only does Jeanette McCurdy go into kind of what it was like as like a child star and having like the pressure of her mother, she also really goes into just what was going on at Nickelodeon and kind of like the weird things that were happening there and the weird ways that just in general child stars are treated. And she's just been through a lot of shit basically in her life, and just the story of her life is written in such a way that it's so compelling and so engrossing. It feels like you really are reading a story. And I also highly recommend the audiobook because it has been voiced by Jeanette McCurdy herself. And then another one of my favorites is Cultish by Amanda Montell. This is about the language that is used in kind of cults, but also cult-ish things. So that is things like pyramid schemes or those like CrossFit things that aren't technically cults, but they feel cult-ish. And most of this book is just stories about these cults or cult-ish things and stories of people who were in those things or have experience with it. So again, it does feel like a big collection of very, very interesting stories, but then also it has a really nice dose of some interesting linguistic information. So that's why I highly recommend this if you're just getting into nonfiction. There's also a whole genre of fiction that is basically just published letters from artists or authors. And the one that I would highly recommend is Letters to a Young Poet by Rainer Maria Rilke. Rainer Maria Rilke is a famous poet, and at some point in his life he started this correspondence with, well, a young poet that wanted advice from Rilke. And all of those advice letters, which aren't just advice on his poetry, they really are advice on life in general, because you can really tell that Rilke had this idea that if you wanted to write good poetry, it basically had to influence your entire life. Like you had to live your life in a certain way. And all of those letters with life advice have been published in this little book called Letters to a Young Poet. If you are a young person with creative ambitions, whether that means you also want to be a poet, or you want to be a writer, or you want to be an artist, or just do anything creative, this life advice from Rainer Maria Rilke is absolutely wonderful. I guess I would say this is the only self-help book I would ever recommend, because it's not necessarily like educational, it's kind of life advice, so kind of self-helpy. And I'm not really a self-help person, I'm not really a self-help fan, but this one I do recommend. And the last book that I want to recommend, that I don't know, maybe you could also call this self-help, it is Come As You Are by Emily Nagoski, which is a book all about specifically female sexuality. And not only is it super educational, but it is also actually helpful. Like, again, this is the kind of self-help that I would recommend, as in it is full of actual tools and like questions and worksheets that you can ask yourself to kind of unlearn a lot of myths about female sexuality. She goes over a lot of really common problems that people come to her with as a sexologist, certain problems that arise in many couples and many women, and she just has them all neatly in this book. I think any woman should read this. It even has little pictures that I cannot show on camera or I will be demonetized. And again, Emily Nagoski is one of those authors that just writes educational stuff in such a easily understandable way. And she also shares, again, a lot of stories from clients, and through those stories kind of explains things, which again just makes this book very entertaining and very readable. And that is the end of Leo's beginner guide to nonfiction. I really hope this helped you. I just hope anyone who hasn't really been able to dabble into nonfiction but really wants to dabble into nonfiction, watch this video and now has a place to start. Please do let me know if you have any beginner recommendations of nonfiction books in the description, or just in general share your favorite nonfiction book. I think my favorite nonfiction book at the moment has got to be All About Love by Bell Hooks. Okay, that was it for me today. I'm going to stop filming before it becomes completely dark. I just want to end this video with a shout out to all of my patrons and a special shout out to all of my elite Patreon members whose names you can see here. I really hope that you enjoyed this video. I hope that you have a wonderful rest of your day, and I will see you soon in another video very soon. Goodbye!